This program is brought to you by Emory University.
All right, welcome everyone, colleagues, to Emory Heart and Vascular Grand Rounds. Today's Monday, February 7th, 2022. I have the real honor and pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Clara Chow. I'll start with the formalities for a minute, and then, and first of all, big thanks to Dr. Chow for joining us. She joins us from Sydney, Australia, and right now it's 11:30 p.m. They're 16 hours ahead, so it's 11:30 p.m. in Sydney, and so she was very gracious to join us to give this grand rounds. And in respect for her time, we usually follow by some faculty meetings afterwards. We're gonna not do that to her at 12:30 a.m. But if there is interest, certainly we can help coordinate one-on-one sessions and meetings with Clara based on schedules and availability. So I might interchange between Dr. Chow and Clara just because she's very successful, but also a dear friend and colleague. So Dr. Chow did her diploma in Japanese studies at Macquarie University in 1993. She then completed her MBBS at the University of Sydney, which is the MD equivalent. And then she did her medicine and cardiology training and completed it with her FRACP, which is the equivalent of our completing cardiology here, with the Royal Australasian College of Physicians in 2004. She then went on to get her PhD in epidemiology and international public health at the University of Sydney in 2008. And then from 2007 to 2009, Clara did her a postdoc fellowship, both clinical and in research. It was at McMaster University in cardiac imaging and in epidemiology and clinical trials. And this is where Clara and I met. We were both postdocs under Salim Youssef at McMaster University. And at that time, it was clear that Clara was a rising star in global clinical trials and in global epidemiology and public health. So since that time, after completing that in 2009, clinically, she began serving as an academic cardiologist at Westmead Hospital in 2010, and then became the program director of community-based cardiac services at the same hospital. So she's been very successful from a clinical angle, and from research standpoint, she rapidly rose the ranks, and 7 years after joining, she became professor of medicine at the Sydney Medical School Faculty of Medicine and Health, and serves as the academic director now of the Westmead Applied Research Center in Sydney University. And she, just to give you a sense of her stature in Australia, she now serves as the president-elect of the Cardiac Society of Australia and New Zealand. She has extensive research in Asian countries, India, China, has over 200 publications, including several in New England Journal and Lancet and JAMA. And her research focus, I just love how she boils it down to one sentence. No, she has more than that, but the sentence that caught me was, much of her research employs a strategy of frugal innovation that creates smart, low-cost solutions to big health problems. And so I thought it would just be, particularly since we're on Zoom, thought it would be interesting to just hear a slightly different perspective from what we often hear in Grand Rounds. And it's with tremendous honor and privilege that introduced Dr. Chow, who's going to speak to us on opportunities to innovate in CVD prevention to address the gaps, where she ties in a lot of her research and potentially some applications for how she's done that clinically as well, or at least tried to fight the good fight to do that. So Clara, thank you so much for joining us. We're very glad to have you.
Thanks, Abby. Gosh, I didn't realize you're going to do such a formal introduction. You're right. I feel more as a colleague than I do as an invited speaker, but very happy to be able to present to your faculty there in Atlanta. I'll get on with it, shall I? And I'll talk to you about this topic around opportunities to innovate in cardiovascular disease prevention. I'll, fairly relaxed talk, but I will touch on a number of the things that you mentioned, and as well as sort of research I'm doing now that is still to come. So I think that you like a learning objective slide. So I'm going to touch on these broad areas. I'm going to touch on the gaps in cardiovascular disease prevention, which I'm sure many of you know about, but I'm just going to touch on a few things that I think are important and relevant to my program. I'm going to discuss digital interventions in cardiovascular disease prevention, potential innovation, and as well as evidence of practice. And then I'm going to discuss innovation blood pressure management, which is something that I've more recently just presented. So you're right, the focus of my program is cardiovascular disease prevention, primary and secondary prevention, but the main strategy I have focused on is what I now call frugal innovation, and that is creating smart, low cost and effective solutions to big problems. Really still targeting the prevention of cardiovascular disease. So I don't need to tell this audience, but the problem is fairly succinct in my mind. Cardiovascular disease remains the leading cause of morbidity and mortality globally. There is substantial evidence on how to prevent cardiovascular disease, but there is a large and persistent evidence practice gap. And I think real innovation is needed to close this gap. So I thought I would start by touching on how I sort of got here a little bit in terms of, my research, and also recalling our postdoctoral period when, I got to know Abi at McMaster University. And I suppose in my research and underlying a lot of my research, even till today, I have continued to highlight the gap in cardiovascular disease prevention, and to a range of stakeholders. So these two papers are both from the PURE study. The PURE study is now got about 200,000 participants in over 25 countries. And this analysis was of the baseline data. Now, the novel thing about PURE is that it includes the majority of the countries are actually lower middle income countries, and there's only a smaller group of high income countries. But what this analysis did was look at all people with coronary heart disease and report on how many of them were on no drugs. I mean, one would expect that these people with coronary disease should be on medications, right? But overall, in this population, over half of them were on no medications, and only, this group, less than 25%, were on 1 drug, 2 drugs, and 3 or more drugs. I mean, this so clearly highlights such a huge gap when you look globally at secondary prevention, that people should be on preventive therapy. Now, this is another analysis from PURE, and this just looks at people with hypertension. And of people with hypertension at baseline in PURE, only about a half of them were aware that their blood pressure was high. The majority that were aware of their blood pressure being high were being treated, so 41% were being treated. But the big jump, or the big drop here, is in the control. Only 13% had controlled blood pressure. I'm actually not going to go through the rest of these papers, but as I said, a lot of my research tries to highlight the gap between what we know and what we do in cardiovascular disease prevention. Some of this particular paper in the MJA highlighted the gap in gender by sex, as in primary and secondary prevention, but mainly this paper was to highlight the gap in secondary prevention, with women less likely to receive secondary preventive therapy than men, and a few other things. So a couple of things I've done sort of more recently was to look at the access to medicines for hypertension. This paper that also arose from my postdoc period, what we did is we did a survey, or I should say a community audit in each of the communities that we recruited to Pure. And there were over 600 communities from which those approximately 150,000 individuals came from. And in each of these communities, we did a pharmacy audit to work out whether medications, blood pressure medications in this case, were available on their shelf, and then to ask whether they were affordable. So this is looking at whether 4 classes of medication were available. And you can see that, red mark was 4 classes, yellow is 2 classes of medications available, and you realize why I'm interested in the multiple classes. But you can see in the majority of low-income countries, there were still a number of places that there weren't medications available. And if I put that to the side and then look at affordability, the proportion of people unable to afford 2 blood pressure lowering medications in high income countries are very low, and that's the yellow line. But if you look at low income countries, the number of people unable to afford 2 blood pressure lowering medicines is about 1/3. And this is low income countries in India. So we pull out India because availability to medicines in India is quite different to other low-income countries. They actually have very good availability, but their affordability is still poor. And the green line is actually looking at whether people were able to afford 2 blood pressure lowering medicines and a statin. And you can see that in low-income countries, over 70% of them wouldn't be able to afford blood pressure lowering medicines and statins. We went on to look at whether if 4 medications were available, what were the odds of people having blood pressure control. And you might see that the more medications that were available and where the combination therapy was available, the more likely people were to have blood pressure control. And this was the same for affordability. So the more affordable medications were, so for affordable medications, that was associated with blood pressure control as well. At any rate, I just wanted to touch on some of that because I think that it's important that we understand not only the gaps in primary and secondary prevention in our own communities, but it is a constant interest of mine to understand that globally. All right, so I'm going to jump to some of the sort of current program of work that I mainly focus on, and that's largely now in digital health. So the 2 broad themes I'm going to touch on is innovative digital health solutions and applying those digital solutions into new models of care delivery, because it's not only about, coming up with fancy new digital health ideas that we can utilize, but it's how we can incorporate them into our care delivery models that actually we still need to innovate in. All right, so I'm going to touch on some examples of how we've innovated in cardiovascular services. So TextCare is a program that I've been working on for some time. What is it? It's text messaging support for people with chronic disease. It was aimed to address the lack of availability, accessibility, and effectiveness of support services for people living with chronic disease. And the theory underlying TextCare is behavior change theory. It uses computerized algorithms to create personalized messages. The messages deliver education, motivation, and support. And unlike current models that are dependent on periodic or face-to-face conversations, it continues across a period of time. So how I got into this was this initial clinical trial called TextMe. It was not a massive trial. It was stood for tobacco, exercise, and diet messages. It was a trial of 710 patients with Crohn's disease. We randomized half the patients to the text message support program and half the messages, half the people to usual care. The messages motivated people, supported people and educated them. They were customized on their diet, physical activity and smoking. And we looked at the outcomes of the LDL cholesterol, blood pressure, smoking, cessation, exercise, and weight in 6 months. I'm not going to go into this trial in any more detail, but to say that we were incredibly surprised that we were able to achieve impact on all of those outcomes, and they were significant. So this TextMe trial that started in 2011 has led to a number of other trials that have looked at text messaging support in medical adherence, in chronic diseases, in diabetes, in gestational diabetes, this last one. And the last grant we got in 2017 was the one that funded the development of the Text Care platform. So, I mean, the majority of the initial work we did here to develop the text message support program, which was a software application that was able to customize the support to patients, was us programming in our back office. But we got to a point where we needed to develop a more robust platform, and we put this to this competition called the Google Impact Challenge and won this amount of money, which we're able to invest in developing a more robust platform to deliver our programs. So TextCare now supports a number of different support programs, and I'm just going to talk to the heart health ones just briefly today. But it's really just taken off, I suppose, in the last couple of years, and we deliver this variety of programs, mainly, well, all in Australia at the moment. So this first one that I thought I'd touch on was heart health during COVID-19. So as I'm sure all of you, occurred for all of you, it was harder to connect with our patients during the COVID-19 pandemic. We had to get our patients in and out and rapidly. They were unable to get to our cardiac rehab programs, and a lot of the exercise programs were closed down. But we wanted to still maintain a connection with them. So at discharge, we sent them a single text message and a program for 6 months. They received 4 messages per week. They were customized on their diet, physical activity, and general heart health, and whether they smoked or not. And we also embedded additional messages with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is just to describe how the model worked. So for example, Tom, age 64, attended a cardiology clinic, or he could have been discharged from hospital. The clinic provided the name and phone number to the text care administrator, and he was sent a single message. Hello, Tom, you've been referred by Westmead Cardiology to receive the general heart health information and support program. And Tom received the text to enroll in the program. So this is a little bit like what the message looked like. He then pressed on this link and he got to this self-registration page. He entered his details and provided consent. There's multi-factor verification for patient security, and the program would start. And these are the sort of things that he would receive. He would, things like, hi Tom, do not ignore your symptoms of heart disease during COVID-19. If you experience worsening chest pain or feel shortness of breath or feel faint, call 000 from Westmead Cardiology. And a variety of information, embedded tips. And Tom received these for 6 months, and he had the option to call a health counsellor if needed. So I just sort of touch on a few little things about this program. One, this is actually the initial few months. So we started this in April 2020, and this was till July 2021. And basically, we just sent out a single text message, all right? And that's it. We didn't, you know, we didn't do this big recruitment thing. We just send out a single text message. Of those single text messages, from the first 10,000, about 3,700, so about 40% enrolled in the program off a single text message. And the opt-out percentage of people in the program before it completed was about 10%. So we were actually pretty impressed with this, that, you know, with a single text message, people were opting into this program, and really we didn't have to do very much else. We've conducted a bit of a survey to ask them about whether they were happy with the program, and you know, the majority found messages easy to understand and messages being useful, and many also reported that the messages motivated them to change their behaviours. And I don't think I'll go into much more detail here because I want to get through a little bit more material, but you know, we got some great feedback. The text messages are easy to read and understand, valuable information to reflect upon a change in making good and healthy choices. I was needing to go for my walk and your text arrived just in time to motivate me out the door. The messages offer support and encouragement. I was not alone in the lockdown. Very good reminders to pay attention to all health factors. So these were some of the text messages we got back. All right, so I'm just going to touch on one other implementation program we've done sort of during this last, I suppose, COVID pandemic era, and that's the My Heart, My Life pilot program. And this is a national program of the Heart Foundation. This program comprises providing patients with a heart attack guide, 2 of them, phone calls from the Heart Foundation, text message journey, which is provided by us, monthly email from the Heart Foundation, and access to the Heart Foundation website. This is actually the evaluation from the Heart Foundation of the program, and patients were asked to report their awareness and use of the My Heart, My Life patient support resources, and patients were most likely to have frequently used the My Heart, My Life text messages. And you know, here there was 78% saying I am aware and frequently use the resource tool with respect to the text message support program. So it's actually really quite interesting to see, compared to all of the other resources provided, this was the program that was most engaging to them. The satisfaction with the overall program was good, but in terms of the text messages, 61% were very satisfied and 39% were satisfied. So in other words, 100% of the people were satisfied with the texting program. And finally, in terms of helpfulness, again, 98% found the texting program helpful. Okay, so I'm just going to jump into some other things now, and these are some newer programs that we're just starting to evaluate, and I just thought I'd describe some of them to you to give a bit of a flavour of the different types of areas the digital health is working in now. So I'll start with something about AF. So why screen for AF? Well, again, I don't think I need to tell this audience that, but obviously if AF is detected early and managed with appropriate anticoagulation, the risk of strokes and mortality can be significantly reduced. However, the gap is that undiagnosed AF is common, especially in older populations, and digital health interventions have mainly been trialled in younger patient populations. But digital population screening interventions have not been implemented. I'm sure many of you in the US will know about the Apple Heart study, but you also know that the average age of participants in those studies is very young. So implementation of digital AF screening faces 2 challenges: developing a sustainable strategy for AF screening in populations at risk, and that is usually older populations, and how to manage the results, ensuring appropriate treatment for newly diagnosed AF. So again, this audience would know that there's now a plethora of screening technologies for AF, and the use of high-tech wearable devices are associated with increased detection rate for AF. I'm not going to go through these different devices, but needless to say, there are many and growing. So we've implemented a pilot study to examine a strategy of remote AF screening using mobile technologies for over 75s that is connected to a central cardiac monitoring center to review ECGs and facilitate appropriate communication with patients and GPs, and thereby facilitate identification and management of AF. So we call this the Mass AF study because our goal is to screen everybody in Australia over the age of 75. Mass screening for atrial fibrillation in the over 75s. So this is an open label randomized waitlist controlled trial where participants are randomized to receive a self-screening device or waitlisted for a device later. It's mainly community recruitment, so we've been advertising the community, and our initial target recruitment was 200 participants. As I said, it's 75 and above. They have to have a smartphone, and they don't. We don't want people that have got already a pacemaker, and obviously no history of AF. So we started this just in our first lockdown here in Australia, and clinical trials became impossible to do. So we had to change this whole thing to a virtual recruitment. And we were able to do that, luckily, with this study. So we sent out the device to the patient. We used this AliveCore sort of credit card size device. We trained our people to use this across virtual and phone calls. They had to record a 30-second ECG, and the ECG then got sent to us, and we reviewed it centrally. So look, this is a progress of the study, and as I said, this was timed with our first, one of our biggest lockdowns here in Australia in May 2021. And I suppose the reason for showing the line is that unlike every other trial that we were conducting, this was the one trial where recruitment continued or started and continued steadily up. We've now recruited about 126 participants to this study. Half of them are female. The median days that they've been engaged is 99 days, and they have sent in total 5,600 ECGs to us. We've so far diagnosed 6 new AFs, and so that's about 10% of the intervention participants. So half for intervention and half for control. Okay, so I'm going to jump to another new study that we're working on, and this is called Chat AF. Just an overview of the design. It's a mixed method study, experimental study with a pragmatic 4-to-1 randomization. So intervention, 4-to-1 control. We collect data at 6 months, and we also are doing semi-structured interviews. The primary outcome here is AF-related quality of life. But the key thing is, what is the intervention? So this intervention is called Chat AF, or Coordinating Healthcare with Artificial Intelligence Supported Technology in Atrial Fibrillation Patients. So just to walk you through what this looks like, this is an IVR-based system. So Max is discharged from hospital with AF. Max GP is sent a letter to say he's enrolled and will be encouraged to do regular check-ins with his GP. In the first 24 hours, Max receives his first phone call from us. It is actually by IVR. And he's reminded to book a GP appointment if he needs help, or in finding a GP, he's given tips as to how he could find a GP. He's also, just after that call, sent access to a web-based education resource platform with customized content, which is available throughout the program. He's also sent additional SMSs and emails weekly to remind him to access the platform and about the different content throughout the program. And as I said, this is driven by IVR, or interactive voice response, an automated phone system technology allowing incoming calls callers to access information via voice response of pre-recorded messages. So at 2 weeks, Max is asked about his symptoms, about his medication adherence, about his medication confidence, and if he has attended his GP. At 1 month, Max is asked about medication adherence again. At 2 months, he's given additional information on lowering alcohol, as well as the importance of blood pressure lowering. At 3 months, he's told how increased stroke risk, he's got increased stroke risk and how to manage that. At 4 months, he is given information about sleep apnea and weight management. And at 5 months, he's asked again about his symptoms, medical adherence, and provided information about AF procedures. So as you can see, as in all of our programs, information is delivered in bite-sized chunks. It goes through sort of routine information, but gives him options on each of the calls to enable him to get more information or less information, as well as report back symptoms. And if a response of his triggers an alert, he will be called by a nurse, and that nurse will be a trained health counsellor from our team. So just to summarize, the Chat AF intervention sends out outreaches. There are 7 outreaches across approximately 6 months. Each outreach is supplemented by text messages, emails, and a website. And the educational website is reordered to be customized for each participant's needs and risk factors. So we are still in progress with this study as well, but we've recruited about 100 patients now. And I think fairly surprisingly, 90% have reported satisfaction, over 90% have reported satisfaction with IVR calls. I don't know about you, but I certainly don't like IVR calls sent by my various businesses that send them. But it would appear patients that receive IVR calls that are coming from us seem to engage with them. 68% have booked or attended their GP by call 2, which is at 2 weeks. We've had about 6% of callers eliciting alerts to call them back. The reasons have been so far low medication confidence, poor overall health, and extreme symptoms, and unable to get to the GP. But we watch this program with interest to see if it can be effective on our outcomes. Okay, so my summary comment for that sort of section of this talk is the digital programs have meant cardiovascular services have been able to provide systematic and consistent offerings to our patients. Program engagement, I think, has been amazing. Program participants have been incredibly grateful. They value the connection with the hospital post-discharge. And the third point, which I probably haven't made, is how much time we spent in designing each of those interventions. And that process, we call it a co-design process, involves consumers, patients, clinicians, and our wider staff. And that process, I think, is what makes each of these digital programs successful, and by really understanding the goals and needs of our clinician, patients, and our health service. All right, I know that I probably shouldn't take questions in the middle, but you'll probably want to come back to this later, because I'm going to now jump track to quite a different area, but it's still in innovation, but that's in innovation in blood pressure management. As Abhi kind of mentioned, I had an exciting last year in that I was able to present the results of this trial to ESC. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend the meeting in Paris, which I would have loved to, but I was still stuck in Australia having to present it over Zoom. And I think that's a screenshot of me talking. But at any rate, it was still an exciting time. I want to touch on quickly the background to this, and I've already alluded to the PURE study. But prior to the PURE study, my PhD was actually based in India and was a cardiovascular in developing cardiovascular prevention programs suitable for low income settings. And in this, we did a survey of 4,500 individuals in rural Andhra Pradesh, and showed that only about half of people were aware. But I think the key other gap in hypertension management is that even though people are aware and they get treatment, many people are still not controlled. Only 13% of people are controlled. And the majority of people on treatment are only on single drug therapy. So it is consistently a problem. Consistently less than 50% achieve blood pressure control despite treatment. And these are all sort of the regions in Pure. And if we look at what people are being treated with, very few of them are using 2 or more medicines. 12.5% of all with hypertension were on 2 or more medications, or a third of those on treatment. And being on 2 or more medications was more likely in high-income countries, slightly higher in women compared to men, and higher in older compared to younger participants. But we all know that we need 2 or more medications to achieve blood pressure control. This is from the SPRINT study, and if we were just trying to get, usual targets, okay, so this is the target of less than 140, so the control arm of SPRINT, and 57% of them required 2 or more medications. But you can see that 17% required 3 medications, and 7% required 4 or more medications, and that was just in the control arm. Now in the intense arm, 87% required 2 or more medications, and you can see that was 3 or more medications for 32%, or 4 or more medications for 24%. Now, you might think I've thrown in the wrong slide, but the point I'm trying to make with this slide is that a single tablet of a potent statin, that is a single tablet, can achieve 50%, greater than 50% LDL reduction in over 70% of patients. So this is the black line, right, is around 70 to 80% on rosuvastatin 40 milligrams. So about 70 or 80% of them can achieve more than 50% LDL reduction with a single tablet. So my question was, can we achieve blood pressure control with a single pill? And so this is what the concept was. The quad pill concept was, can we do that? So our initial concept was described in the Lancet in 2020, and that was the quad pill, bringing together 4 medications, each at a quarter of the standard dose. And the reason why I stick this tweet up here is to remind me that this study first got funded in 2014, and how long it takes for ideas to come to fruition. So why did we start thinking about this? Well, an important pharmacological thing is that a quarter dose of a blood pressure lowering medicine doesn't give you a quarter of the blood pressure lowering effect. So this is actually a systematic review of all quarter dose trials. So this is 1 quarter dose, 36 trials, 4,700 patients, and the reduction in blood pressure is about 5 millimeters. 2 quarters reduce blood pressure by 7 millimeters. All right, and people would know that a blood pressure medication tends to reduce blood pressure by 8 or 9 millimeters. So 5 millimeters is about 60% of a full dose in terms of blood pressure lowering effect. So 4 quarters. So this is our pilot trial, actually. So this is we did a pilot where we randomized people in a crossover design to 4 quarters and versus placebo. And 4 quarters reduced blood pressure by 22 over 12 millimeters of mercury, or about 4 times 5, right? So about 4 times a quarter. So in other words, blood pressure lowering effects across classes are additive. And 4 quarters are also more efficacious than monotherapy, was our other theory. So the other thing about the theory was the question of whether a quarter dose versus placebo, and comparing a quarter dose versus placebo and quarter dose versus standard dose with respect to side effects. So adverse events were reported in about 14 trials, and comparing quarter dose versus placebo, there was no difference in adverse events compared to placebo. And 2 quarters versus placebo, there was also no difference in adverse events. And a quarter dose versus standard, there was less adverse events in quarter doses versus a standard dose, and less adverse events in 2 quarter doses versus standard dose. So our other interest here was whether 4 quarters would actually have less adverse events compared to sort of a standard. Okay, so here's the design summary of the quartet trial. So the aim was is the approach of starting with a quad pill more effective than the common one of starting with monotherapy? So the common strategy of managing blood pressure in the majority of the world still now is to start with monotherapy and then up titrate. But what we were proposing here is that people started with a quad pill. This was a double-blind randomized clinical trial, 1-to-1, multi-center, untreated clinic blood pressure greater than or equal to 140/90, or on monotherapy and willing to switch with a clinic blood pressure greater than 130/85. Our primary outcome was change in mean automated unattended office systolic blood pressure at 12 weeks. But we also looked at these other measures, as well as did a longer term assessment out to 52 weeks. So here's the design in a figure. We screened 743 people, randomized 591. Yes, we got a bit stuck with COVID, but we were able to get to nearly our target, which was 650. Half of them received the quad pill, half received initial monotherapy, as I said, blinded. At week 6, they had a clinic visit and they were able to up titrate their medications at that point. If clinic blood pressure was greater than 140/90, they were initially advised to start with amlodipine 5 milligrams, which was provided by the study, but could add other medications. At 12 weeks was our primary outcome. We took an extended cohort through to 26 and 52 weeks, and that was 417. Participants that could go on to the 52 weeks. So the age was about 58, 40% female, majority white, 57% no blood pressure medicines at baseline, and obviously the others on monotherapy, and a fairly BMI about 30. Okay, so this is to describe to you sort of what the treatments patients were on at the 12-week mark and the 52-week mark. So the intervention group, 84% were just on the quad pill, with 11% having 1 additional drug, a very small number with 2 additional drugs, and 2% were just on 1 drug alone, which wasn't the quad pill. The control arm, 58% were on the monotherapy or the irbesartan alone, 32% on the irbesartan plus 1 drug, 7% on the irbesartan plus 2 drugs, and a small percentage on 1 drug alone, which was not the study therapy. At 52 weeks, I suppose relatively similar, though 16% now up titrated with 1 drug and 8% up titrated with 2 drugs in the quad pill arm, and in the control arm, 33% having additional 1 drug and 10% having the additional 2 drugs. All right, so up titration occurred in 15% on the intervention and 40% of the control by 12 weeks. So this is our primary outcome slide. And at 12 weeks, the primary outcome of unattended blood pressure was lower in the initial quad pill versus the initial monotherapy arm by 7 millimeters of mercury. So 76% achieve control in the intervention arm versus 58% in the best care, usual care arm. And at 12 months in our sustained, continued extended follow-up cohort, the difference was maintained between the two groups, even though there were many opportunities to up-titrate blood pressure medications in either arm. So blood pressure control at 12 months was 81% in the intervention arm versus 62% in the control arm. And this is the tolerability. So overall good tolerability in the intervention compared to the control arm, with no real significant differences. And adverse events here, and at 12 weeks, there were 12 withdrawals versus 7 withdrawals, treatment withdrawals for any adverse event in the intervention versus control arm, with a p-value of 0.27. So summary comments here are the quad pill strategy was able to achieve 80% control with a single pill in the majority. And you know, I want to point out that the best control rates in the world are around 50 to 60%. And the STEP strategy was not able to catch up. Blood pressure control could be low-hanging fruit when it comes to prevention of cardiovascular disease globally. And I think addressing barriers to blood pressure control is long overdue. Newer approaches rather than completely newer treatments, I think, could be key. Of course, achieving intense blood pressure control will be our next challenge. Okay, so I'm going to finish there, but hopefully bang on with 10 minutes for questions. Yeah. Happy to take them. Shall I stop sharing, Hadi, and see if people want to discuss them?
Yes, that'd be that's great here. Thank you, Clara. That was a fantastic talk, and I think you blended together the two components that I've been aware of that you've been working on. You know, the digital innovations in terms of using text messaging and those platforms for recruiting patients and for delivering education, and then also your work on the polypill concept. Do we have any questions from the audience for Dr. Chow?
Yeah, I'll be glad to ask a question. So first of all, Dr. Chow, thank you for your excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it. And thanks for joining us in your late evening hours there in Australia. So I know you mentioned the gaps in care in low and middle income countries. In a high income country like the United States, we have similar challenges, and we have low and middle income country equivalents in our own backyard here in the US. If we use the 2017 hypertension guidelines, less than 25% of Americans have their blood pressure under control, and there are 37 million Americans not receiving optimal statin use who are at high risk. And so I was going to ask, just touching upon larger systems approaches, and of course, measuring, reporting, and then paying, because prevention, as you said, we have proven and effective approaches that work, but we are woefully challenged related to the implementation piece. And then related to your quartet study, what were your measures for BP? Were office-based? And I was interested as to why you didn't choose SMBP monitoring, home-based monitoring, basically.
Thanks. So I wasn't going to sort of present US data back to people from the US with respect to the gap in control, though I am a bit familiar with them as well. And actually, excitingly, we have a sister trial currently running in the US of quartet. So hopefully that'll focus in on some of the populations there that you speak of. But you're absolutely right. There's so many things that could be done in terms of system of care issues. I suppose, you know, I've watched this for a while, and I'm sure you have watched it for a while, but the gap has persisted for all of my career, and probably many other people's careers. And I suppose I just challenge people to innovate and try to turn things upside down, because I mean, this is a big problem that we've known about for a long time. Absolutely, system level things could be a thing. Absolutely, incentive models can be a thing, but I suppose my call to people is it's time to implement. And if we can't implement what we know, we need to innovate in how we do that. Sorry, your second question was about why we didn't use home blood pressure monitoring, I think, for
Yes,
our outcome.
yeah.
So, you know, sometimes you're influenced by what are the recent studies of the time. And I suppose we wanted to get the most robust measure of blood pressure to be able to defend against all these hypertension mafia people around me. So I went a bit overboard and did unattended office, 24-hour ambulatory, and did office blood pressure, but I didn't send home a home monitor. So that was probably the only blood pressure measure I didn't do. Admittedly, I did look at it, and actually, you know, I suppose it depends on your costs, but it probably wouldn't have costed us any less sending home a home blood pressure monitor, and it probably would have cost us a little bit more getting everybody to send the data in well, though it certainly would have been interesting to look at. But I mean, they were some of the things that went through our mind as we decided on our blood pressure measures, but we did do the others.
Great. We have a question from Dr. Wanger.
Yes, Dr. Chow, very lovely talk. Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Let me ask you a question of the cost of the formulation of this quad pill. Do you have any estimate of the cost of formulation as compared with a conventional monotherapy?
Look, there's a cost that I suppose was incurred by us in doing the trial, and I suppose there's the cost of, I suppose, bringing that sort of thing to market. The concept is a concept. So it was taking 4 classes of blood pressure medicines that are all generic and currently on shelves here in Australia and there in the US, and taking half doses of actually each of them and halving them in a specific pharmacist that was able to halve them and then pack them, encapsulate them in a tablet with packing material. And that's how we actually made the quad pill for the trial. We used the over encapsulation thing as you do in clinical trials, and we over encapsulated control tablets as well as intervention tablets to get the active and control sort of therapies. And so in other words, if they broke them open, they would see similar things inside. So, I mean, all of those medicines should be available. Now, if you ask me how you make it into a single formula, it gets a lot more complicated, and combining 4 medications into one, I think, you know, as I've talked to various pharma companies, it's not as easy bringing all of those things together, and it will require probably commercial partners, which we're looking at. But you know, the struggle in the polypill area, interestingly, is that a lot of these companies are not seeing, I suppose, a clear commercial or a simple commercialization pathway with polypills. So I'm not sure how that will go. Now, if patients in Australia here want this, we've got various companies now that will formulate into little sachets, 4-quarter doses, and measure them up and provide them in little sachets. So this is one way. Now, I don't know if I've answered your question directly, but I suppose the cost of the medicines are the medicines that are currently available on your shelves.
You know, these are all very inexpensive medications. And if there were one way to put them together into a polypill and commercialize it, the difficulty, I think, is that most of these are now generic and no one has a vested interest. But I thought that the lack of side effects was really stunning. And perhaps that might be something that should be thought about on a scalable basis.
I'm hoping so.
Great. Any other questions for Dr. Chow? Dr. King, I see you came on video.
Yeah, this is fascinating, the effectiveness in this study, because I think most people would think of the poly pill as sort of a, not really the optimal way to personalize medicine and so forth. And yet you've shown that it may be the most effective for these people. To make this work commercially, it seems to me the poly pill needs to be much more expensive than the combination to entice pharma to get into this, and regulatory, of course, might be an issue. But I think you should consider this. Should consider making the poly pill a very expensive pill that people will want to take, because that's the way Americans think anyway.
Yeah, I hear you. The reverse psychology, isn't it, of value or whatever it is. I find it a struggle, because obviously part of the goal was to achieve hypertension control for all, and now I'm struggling to work out how to take this sort of theory into real commercial practice. But I agree absolutely. I mean, the goal was to try to work out whether a single pill can control blood pressure, and I feel like if I compare the single statin getting 70% blood cholesterol control, this single quad pill could get blood pressure control in 80%. So I do feel like we should get it out there, but I am struggling with working out the next step here.
There's some conflict or tension between trying to go to pharma and making it an expensive pill, because some people like to think if they pay for something more expensive, it's better and more effective. And that's sort of a direct tension to Clara's mindset and heart, where she's trying to go for frugal innovations that are widely applicable and can be disseminated in also low and middle income settings, as she started the talk out by saying. I'll ask a question, Clara, just to follow up. I'm sure that how are you planning to scale up now that you've presented Quartet at ESC, and what are your next steps in terms of scaling it up to test impact on heart outcomes or on other patient important outcomes? Because that might be the first, that might be the next step before you sort of get before you get uptake by pharma and others to market this kind of thing.
Yeah, it's been interesting. We've actively debated whether we need an outcome trial. We've actively debated it because, we're all kind of blood pressure enthusiasts. So we're pretty convinced that lowering blood pressure lowers cardiovascular events. We don't need another trial to show lowering blood pressure lowers cardiovascular events. So the question is whether you're happy with that as a strong enough surrogate, because effectively, the majority of blood pressure drugs that have come in after haven't necessarily required event trials to get them through reg. But saying that, we are wondering where to next. We have been actually talking to various formulation groupings and chemists and pharmacists, because actually it isn't that straightforward to put together 4 medications in one. And yes, Mark Huffman is the one who's leading the Quartet study here there in the US, a good friend and collaborator, also from our period of time through the McMaster camp. But yes, I think that the next thing we will do is try to actually start formulating it and evaluating it in different and larger studies.
Great. We'll have one last question from Dr. Linderman. For patients with insufficient blood pressure control, have you considered dose escalation by taking 2 quad pills instead of adding on one drug monotherapy. Look at that, Dr. Linderman already sort of trying to innovate on your innovation. That's
oh, great, Dr. Lindemann. Very much on your mind. Actually, that we debated that too when we designed the trial, whether instead of a step up, we should just double the tablet, because it could have been double the monotherapy of irbesartan or double the quad pill. And it could be, instead of adding, we could have just doubled it. So yes, a very good idea. I'm trying to work out how we argued it in the end, but I think we wanted a similar step up in each approach. And that's why we ended up just going with the step up with amlodipine and then whatever other medications. But absolutely, that could be the simplicity of it. You could just double the quad pill if you wanted to increase therapeutic effect.
That's terrific. Clara, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. It's now like past midnight. It's 12:30 a.m. on Tuesday, very early morning in Sydney. And yet there you are smiling at us, having talked about what I know has been your passion from day one. Again, very grateful and a pleasure to have you. Clara, are you in a position to just stay on for 5 minutes in case others have questions? Otherwise,
look, I'm very happy. I'm quite wide awake now. I was a bit sleepy at the start of the talk, but I'm quite wide awake now.
Okay.
So,
but for the rest of our colleagues, this concludes grand rounds for those who want to stay on for a couple of minutes to engage with Dr. Chow. You're welcome to do so. If anyone has a question about, or if anyone has interest in connecting with Dr. Chow about research or opportunities for collaboration, I'm happy to help coordinate that, or you could reach out to Dr. Chow directly as well. But thank you very much. We're happy to stay on for a conversation for a few others. Otherwise, thanks everyone for joining.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.